6:32 p.m.
Okay, you're
And
recording.
place it. Okay, thank you. And obviously, our starting point is Tony, and he did communicate with me that he was available. So hopefully, we'll see him shortly. Eric, how you doing?
I was muted. Sorry about that. Good. How you doing? What's going on?
Good. Yeah, I see you got sucked in on the soccer board too, huh?
I sure did.
Yeah. What'd you end up with? Corresponding or recording?
I don't even know.
Yeah. I
Whatever.
saw you.
Whatever Lee was last year, I think it's just taking a minute. So
Yeah, that's all it is. Yeah, well, you got to type them up, and then they're supposed to be posted on the web for public.
so I got to figure out how to do all that. But
Because there is a spot, there is an area where you can post all the minutes. Not that they're all there, but
yeah. No, I'll take a look at that. They're on the website, right?
they are on the website. Yeah, you can see somewhere there is a board minutes tab or link or something or another.
Yeah, I'll take a look at that tomorrow just to kind of get familiar with it.
I'm too old for those things. Those days gone.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, hopefully comes on soon because actually I got a 7:15. I got a hockey practice I got to get off to. So
I just sent Tony, Tony did respond. I'm sorry to
Okay.
interrupt, but
No,
he
thank you.
responded. He said that he just needed the link. So I am just forwarding
Let me
it to him. He should have no problem once I send this along.
all right, great. Yeah, I thought, I'd asked Josh to send him a link, but
And he may have, I mean,
he
it's,
may have. Yeah,
it's not
I'm sure Tony gets his fair share of links to Zoom meetings.
exactly, it's not unheard of. Okay, here comes Tony. I'm gonna let him in. And once he gets situated, I'll see if he's okay being the co-host so he can share his screen. Tony? Hi, Tony.
There's Tony.
Hi, Tony.
How you doing?
Good, we can hear you.
Great.
Tony,
All right, so
I'm making you the co-host. Is that okay, Tony?
That's fine.
Great. Okay, great.
hey Tony, this is Nathan. I'm hoping you can share maybe a couple of the past budget resolutions with us too while we're talking.
1 second. I will pull up last year's. There were some minor changes.
Okay.
Um,
And what I would ask Tony, me and Eric have, been around a little bit. Julie's newer. If you could just give us, again, the history of this, what the goals are of the resolution, what's
Yeah.
been done historically, that would be great.
Yeah. 1 second. 2. Okay. Share. Can you see?
I can see it on my screen.
All right. So you get confused on what year it is, but can everyone else see?
Yes.
Okay, so I have Julie, Nathan, and Eric.
How you doing, Tony?
All right. So this originated many years back when the town of Bridgewater was financially up against it. And the town had negative free cash. I believe it was 2009. Forgive me if I have the year wrong. And what was happening up to that point is the fundamentally, the revenues were being estimated too aggressively. I think you all have been on the finance committee at least the last 2 years, and you've seen the presentation I've done on free cash and where the source of free cash comes from. And a large chunk of that comes from your revenue, mostly local receipts. All right. So fundamentally, that was what was impetus to creating a budget resolution or budget guidelines on how the town was going to determine its revenue. The conservative approach was the revenue estimates for local receipts was one of the components. And at the time, they would look back to the prior year's actual. So let's say, for example, we were doing the budget resolution now for FY22. They would look back not at where we are in FY21 for local receipt revenue, look to FY20's actuals. And then the resolution says you will only budget 85% of FY, in this case, for example, 20's actuals. So it was, not only was it conservative, 15% less what actuals were from the prior fiscal year that had closed, but it wouldn't even take into consideration what was going on or whether there was revenue trends that were showing something differently. Fundamentally, that was put in place because there was poor practices and there wasn't a disciplined approach to revenue estimate. So fundamentally, that drove the local receipts portion of the revenue estimate. The other piece was new growth. The new growth calculation was set in the budget resolution, the new growth dollar was set at around $350,000. Again, a very, very conservative approach, but back in 2009, I think there was some new growth that was just over $400,000. They had some new growth years that was just over $400,000. Also, the analytical data they didn't have for local receipts. They also didn't have the analytical data or the processes that we have in place on new growth, where we are really more proactive and understanding where our new growth is and where it's going. So a lot of it has to do with disciplines and practices that required a very, very conservative approach to budgeting for revenues. And that's the first part of your budget process. You got to know what your revenues are before you set your guidelines for your departments to begin to form their budgets for the next coming year. So that's typically how it would work. Because over the last 5 years, and because of that process, it led to some significant free cash in 2016 and in 17. So when I started to get involved with the finance committee in approximately 17, I began to be, I was asked to provide some input to the resolution. And I worked with, at the time, the finance committee was present, and they had some insight as well. The finance committee at that time's insight was, we just want to make sure that whatever you come up with for numbers, that those are accurate and we can move forward in our budget deliberations, and so can the departments and the town manager, and feel confident that we're going to achieve whatever revenue estimates you feel are warranted. The Budget and Finance Subcommittee of Council, Bill Wood and myself particularly, started to get more involved in how we could spell this out. And I provided some input. And as I go down this document, I can point to the input that I provided. So where I got involved in was starting to give some high-level structure to what does sound financial condition mean? Because the attempt of this is to ensure that as we move through the budget process, that we establish a budget based on revenues that are sustainable or more likely sustainable, unless there's an economic downturn. And for those who've been on the committee for a while, you know what our practice has been, and you see the results of it. So we define the sound financial conditions as follows, right? Cash solvency, budgetary solvency, long-term solvency or sustainability, service solvency, reserve solvency, and our bond rating, which is now higher than the AA3. And so that gave the broad brush guidelines as to what do we have to keep in our mindset as we move into the actual calculating and estimating of our revenues and to what end. So this is kind of like to what end, the sound financial condition. And so we began to break this out. Again, I don't want to go through each and every part of this, but fundamentally, when you are budgeting from revenue, you have to ensure to the extent that you can that revenue is sustainable looking out 2, 3, 4 years. Because what you don't want to do is make budget decisions based on revenues that you know or have a concern about them being present and or growing at some level consistent with your budgetary practices in order to sustain it, because you don't want layoffs and you don't want the disruption of budgeting too aggressively. So you'll hear in the statement here, I'll highlight it. You don't want to use revenues where recurring operating costs, you want to budget using recurring operating costs will be funded by recurring sources of revenue, not one-time non-recurring revenue, all right? We have a target of what we wanted our fund balance to be, undesignated fund balance or free cash. Last year, it was moved down to 1.25%. That was prior to us knowing anything about COVID. That wasn't my recommendation, but it was this board's and the Budget and Finance Subcommittee's recommendation. Mine was still to stay at the 1.75%. And I'll get to why I still think that's important. And as you know, what we wanted to do is we also wanted to make sure whatever we did up here was going to give us a result so that could maintain 10% of our operating budget. So in our stabilization fund. So you can see revenues coming in, there has to be a certain degree of cushion or surplus that's going to be generated so that it can flow to capital, so it can flow and help offset snow and ice deficits, and so that it can flow and support the objective of meeting the stabilization fund, 10%. And then you looked at your revenues. And the revenues, I think I've covered enough. On the expenditure side, I think these are a few changes here, one particularly. One I wanted to clarify, and this was my recommendation, that when we go to estimate our budgets or specifically our major cost drivers, that we make sure we take into our mind's eye that those recurring revenues and those sustainable revenues has to be matched up against our cost drivers. So what are our cost drivers? Salaries and benefits. It's that simple. 90% of the budget is salaries and benefits. So we constantly have to be looking at that. The expense piece has always been less of an issue, although we do have, there's a caveat that I'll mention, I'll point to, because I really think it needs to be taken into consideration with this year's budget resolution. I've talked to the town manager about this as recently as today. The other part, another part that it was new is, and this goes to the conversation I had with the town manager today, is maintaining our capital assets. So one of the things that the town has to begin to wrestle with now is that the town, as a practice, which in fact becomes a policy, is to defer major maintenance costs and to defer major capital expenditures required to maintain buildings and infrastructure. When I say buildings and infrastructure, infrastructure is roadways, sidewalks, signage, playgrounds, all those things that are in fact structures of some sort. So one of the things that we wanted to put in here is that we need a budget that has maintenance built into it, which the town hasn't even had the moment to take a breath and pause to say, what is it that we really need? But we need to start to look at how are we going to maintain these assets. You all have lived through the new town hall, the Academy building. If you want to look at the practice of maintaining buildings in the town of Bridgewater, what it was is maintain as little as possible, defer maintenance costs for for buildings, and when they get in a place of full decline or severe decline, we'll then spend some money to take care of them or repair them or replace them. That practice has been, in fact, the policy by default because of how maintenance and capital has historically been funded up until recently. Okay. And the third was to begin to build the maintenance budget to support the maintenance of your capital assets. Well, last year we did add some money into the building maintenance budget. But what we have been trying to do for the last 3 years, and we're really, I think, at that point where we can truly turn and begin to face this dilemma here is, or this challenge here of budgeting what we feel is necessary to maintain our capital assets and infrastructure, is we needed to really do a wholesale investment in our capital equipment. You've heard this before, bears repeating, that we're finally out of a situation where, example, highway department no longer has a 1996 frontline vehicle on the road, right? They have 2000s. They even have some 2018s and 19s. That's one example. The ambulances are on a rotating replacement schedule. The police cruisers are on a rotating replacement schedule. That has taken my 5-year tenure, 6-year tenure to get to. When you have that in place and you know what revenue you need in surplus, that 1.25% or 1.75%, then you know you'll have an inflow or should have an inflow of revenue to go to your capital stabilization fund to fund your capital equipment. So we know that the coming year, these two, B and C, are really going to need attention. And in fact, the council had a discussion at their last meeting about both these items. I think you know there's a director of facilities that came on board. It's just on a contract basis right now. We hope to be able to afford him a year out from now, but that will be dependent upon our budget in this coming year, so that we can start to do what the school has done historically, is have someone that's responsible for oversight of that and to do the due diligence necessary to set up an entire maintenance plan for our buildings and infrastructure mostly our buildings in this case, so that we can begin to plan out major service steps that are required for mechanicals, roofs, doors, windows, all the things that someone with that technical background can do a much better job and is necessary in order to plan and budget properly. So that's kind of how the first part of this is laid out. And then it says, okay, so what's the town manager's objectives in relationship to that? And those are the four that are typically present. There hasn't been a lot of changes. I can tell you that this has been something that has been really done well by the town manager's office. We have availed ourselves to probably as aggressively as any community that I've ever been affiliated with or consulted with. The town has done a great job at finding alternative funding sources. And I can answer any questions you have with respect to that, but we're talking millions and millions of dollars. We also have looked at, like, for instance, do we need to go out and instead of adding another body, especially in overhead areas such as administration, legal or technical, do we go hire that person to come in full time, or do we contract that out so that we can afford to pay for a period of time, but we're more able to be resilient and adaptive if the economic conditions change? And or is it better just to get that real technical experience that we can get out in the marketplace for a short period of time, because that's the only time, really the only project we may be working on that really requires that? Or are there some of activities that we really don't want to make the capital investment for to handle items such as we made a decision for all of our catch basins that we were going to subcontract that, because to get a piece of equipment that was to do that and then to hire the staff to man that there wasn't a cost benefit to it. It's better to go out and subcontract that in order to meet that requirement and not have to put out that capital investment. And for the most part, the last piece I think I would point to is we wanted to maintain the current service levels, which means don't lay anyone off, maintain adequate expense budgets so that those employees could deliver on the services that were presently being provided to the residents of Bridgewater. So I hope I gave you a narrative as to, what framework this gives us, and gave you a little bit of a narrative as it relates to where we think we need to, spend our time thinking more fully about in order to move ourselves to a more what I call proactive, forward-thinking perspective, and move away from deferring major maintenance to our facilities and so forth, and more to maintaining those assets and infrastructure so we can extend the useful life, and we do the major repairs on a timely basis so we don't do further damage to our buildings that can occur if you're not maintaining them properly and you're not staying up with your maintenance and you're not making the major investments in those facilities that are required to extend the useful life. Typically on a building, if you truly have a great maintenance plan and you really do major improvements to it, you can extend it. If a building has a useful life fully depreciated at 30 years, you could add another 30 years to a municipal building if the right things are done in the right order at the right time. So I hope I didn't bore you to death, and hopefully that gives some insight as to what this document has evolved to. It was, let's make sure we don't spend money we don't have, to let's start to think more forward, and let's make sure that when we do have reserves, there's a reason for those reserves, capital, stabilization fund. And I think you've seen this year, being FY21, that we have reaped the benefits of those, the prior budget resolutions and the practices. Because we do have 10% in our stabilization fund, and we've been able to fund, I gave the group a document, I think over $4 million in capital equipment and some facilities repairs over the last 3-4 years. Any questions on what I provided?
You know, I thought it was interesting what you were, you know, saying about the maintenance, Tony.
Mhm.
I can clearly see that that is a need that in the town here.
Yep.
It is something that has been avoided because, like you said, a lot of times there was no choice but to.
Yep.
Now, when you know, and so would we want to think about directing a certain percentage of revenues towards a fund like that in the near future, or?
Well, one thing I'd like to start to think, and I think we're ready to do this thinking, is so what this capital plan coming up for this year, I know that with the work with the facilities director, who I meet with tomorrow, that we can come up with what two prongs. One, we can begin to map out what we're going to need over the next 3 to 5 years. And we can work that backwards. And again, high level initially in this budget process and in this resolution, but it may be delineated a little further as to, you know, where are we going to be with mechanicals, where are we going to be with roofs, where we're going to be with, you know, windows, doors, major repairs. And then once we frame that, which will be prior to our budget process, what are the typical maintenance budgets that are required for a building? So this gentleman has done this for many years. And I think maybe even some of you are in this field. You can begin to do some estimating on, for instance, let's use the town hall, for instance. The town hall was an $8 million, $9 million building, right? Well, there's a certain cost per square foot of maintenance costs that one could use at high level estimating for this particular building, the town hall. So I'm giving you all the pieces. I think we need to start to spell out what does maintaining of capital assets look like. And I can spell out what portion of that is going to need to be funded from recurring sustainable revenue, which you would work into your operating budget. And then what portion we need to either begin to set aside for large capital purchases, and does that money flow from our revenue stream into our capital stabilization, or do we start to look at overlapping bonding requirements in order to do those major repairs in bulk? For instance, 6 buildings need roofs over the next 5 years, so you go out and bond for roofs, or buildings need new mechanicals, you know, HVAC and doors and windows and things like that. And let's look at what that bonding, and we start to look at how we are going to pay for this. So there's going to be some combination. So I think how we're going to pay for this is really the discussion under both of these. And I think we can start to have those conversations. And then that kind of drives what you want for your reserves at the end of the year. And the reason I say reserves at the end of the year to build reserves to then plan, again, it gives you, and maybe it's too conservative, it gives you room to maneuver. So when you go to actually have your plan and you can be disciplined in how you're using the revenue that you're using, you begin to feel more confident that you'll be able to do the work that you need to do in both these areas. The other way to do it is, hey, we're going to start to build that into our operating budget, all of it at one time, which might take $600,000 out of next year's growth and revenue immediately. So to get from where we are today to where we want to go, what we've done with everything else we've done it a little step at a time to get to the vision of we need an additional $500,000 or $600,000 or $700,000 in our building maintenance budget. But we can't just flip a switch and get there tomorrow.
Yep.
Unless action was taken. And municipalities only have one action, and that's an override. So I think these two items here are where I think we could benefit in spending some time as to what type of capital assets, what things are maintenance, what things are large capital investment, and how's the revenue going to come in order to look at this objectively, and where we'd like to be 3, 4, 5 years from now.
Hey, Tony, just a quick question for you, because I think, again, hitting on your earlier point, a lot of this was built so conservatively because prior to you and Michael being involved, we didn't have reporting and we didn't have great revenue tracking systems. And so this kind of, without that reporting, kept us from getting in trouble. What do you think the temperature is going to be for trying to revise the way we think about things with COVID, right? So like last year we had to borrow from the stabilization fund. I assume, and I could be wrong, based on what we're seeing in Boston and some other places right now, shutting down restaurants again, and we could have a shortfall again this year. I'm just trying to get a feel for that, because I understand everything you're saying and it makes perfect sense to me. But I think a lot of people are going to say, well, why'd you change it in a year where you had a lot of financial uncertainties? So can you help me?
Yeah, I think what we need to do, even though we're in whether or not we can take the action this year, I think is probably kind of like a foregone conclusion that we're not going to be able to do a lot more going on a plan if we had a plan to address what we're talking about here. But I think to frame it now, to actually understand it so that we're ready to shift when we can feel that the economy is recovering, because we all know the economy won't recover until this whole COVID thing is finally put to bed. And in the meantime, we're probably going to have to consider dipping into our reserves. Although I'm going to talk a little bit about what I have for some forward-thinking forecasting on our new growth, which I believe is going to help us in FY22. But yeah, I think the real reality is, Eric, is that we can think about it, we can talk about it, and we'll probably make some sense out of it. But the time to actually effectuate that change is going to take a bit,
Yeah. Okay, that's fair. Yep.
Yeah.
So let's go back to, we lowered the number for the reserve fund there. By half a percentage point, and going back to what you and Eric were just kind of going back and forth about the economic uncertainty. And it's certainly not going to just be next year. We know that the economy kind of works on a slower, a longer time length than that. So if we look at, 2 or 3 years of, economic uncertainty, does it make sense in your mind to go back to save more right now, if we can?
My feeling, and just remember when this was put together, right? We weren't faced with, well, let me get my right year on, right? So let me give some other context. One of the things that we do in our budgeting in normal years, right? Then we would just be letting this play out and see where our numbers ended at the end of the year, and to see if we could meet our 1.25. That would just be the normal case. And I would be sitting here saying, we shouldn't have a problem with that, right? Normal year. All right.
Yep.
So between the time the budget was set and the recap was set, that's when you set the tax recap rate and we submitted all those documents. I had to maneuver all the revenue streams for local receipts in order to make sure, and local aid, in order to make sure that we still had a balanced budget And because we were more conservative with our state revenue than what it came in at, we were able to dial back some of our local receipt numbers.
Mhm.
You see, let me make sure I make this, let me sure I make that point clear. When we come up with revenue estimating, we are providing the buckets as we know them. So the four buckets are real estate taxes, which includes new growth. It's good to say that our new growth estimate was really on with the one we had used for our budgeting, maybe $50,000 or $60,000 more. So that was to the plus. Our state aid ended up being about $350,000 more than what we planned, because we were using a conservative estimate. And we didn't get the final state numbers until 4 weeks. No, we got actually the final state numbers a week ago. They didn't start working on them about 30 days ago. So within my authority, I shift all the buckets that are necessary in order to make sure the collective revenue, and I gave you 3 out of the 4, the collective revenue is going to meet what was approved by council for the operating budget. So because state revenue came in, that allowed me to dial back the local receipts. So right away I can say we should, based on that dialing back, achieve better than 1.25 this year. That's being completely transparent. And I can only say that we got the tax rate approved last week. And we got, like I said, the state numbers 2 weeks ago. And we didn't even get them talking about the final state numbers until 30 days ago. So that has just all taken place. So I can feel comfortable with this 1.25, which should also allow us to end up at a better position at the end of this fiscal year than originally planned. So that's good. So now to your question about next year. Because we've been putting in place certain forecasting, this past summer, I set the objective of the assessor group to come up with a pre-new growth figure by October, this past October. Okay? Because of the work that Shelley and her staff did, I can tell you with a high degree of certainty what our new growth number will be at minimum for the FY21-2 budget. Now, this is kudos to the staff there and to you guys in 4 years of financial turnaround, 5 years of financial turnaround. We're going to have a number around 750 to 800,000. So right away, right now, I have a level of comfort with what we're stepping into for new growth for our 2.5%. And I think I'm also pretty certain that whatever revenue estimates we're using right now from local receipts are conservative enough that we won't be looking in the final analysis at the end of this year that we would need to increase those that significantly if we go through our budgetary process conservatively this year. The piece I don't know is what the state will be doing. And I think the state has held on with us this year the way I think, and that is, let's keep a degree of certainty in place, and what you guys think and what the council thought, let's use reserves, because the worst thing we can do is create this huge disruption, because disruption, although it appears to save you money, in the end costs you more, because disruption is never an efficient way of, major disruption, I mean laying people off or slashing budgets, is seldom, it's a last resort. It's seldom a good, effective way to manage your operation and your resources. Okay, so that's where the state came from. So going into next year, that's the caveat. So that might be 10% below what this year's numbers are. could be 15%, could be 20% below. So it could be between $400,000 to $600,000 to $700,000 to $800,000 less. I'm not certain of that. That's the wild card. So should we plan for more? I think we should plan for more if at all possible. The things we have to really do in this cycle, and what other communities are doing, is we have all of our bargaining units up for renegotiation. They were all held whole with their contracts through FY21. When we go into, we have to bring into those negotiations, what are our cost drivers? Salaries and benefits. We have to address those that drive costs in the context of where we are financially. So we believe, management believes, that we have a practical and reasonable position to expect bargaining units to be open to the economic circumstances that we're faced with. That would be a lever of some sorts to help us get through this. We also would like to think we have credibility and we have goodwill with the bargaining units, because your group and the council both, without bat an eye, approved $1.6 million of stabilization fund money to balance the budget and maintain the headcount and support the contracts that were in place. That we believe, management believes, cannot be left unnoticed. It has to be, because it's what we've been promising these bargaining units we would do as we negotiated contracts and we built our reserves. And it's also the stance we took with the school when we were negotiating what the town could afford as an increase to the operation of the school budget, the district. So if you put that all in place, long-winded answer to, I'd like that number certainly not to go down. I'd like to see it move up if we can afford it and still balance our budget without disrupting our headcount. And based on the new growth number that I feel and where I have some room in our local receipts, if we collectively go into this budgetary season like we did with last budgetary season, I believe some combination of reserves, contracts that aren't escalating with COLAs, some room in the new growth number that I put forth to you, and some ability to reasonably move our local receipt numbers up. I'm optimistic that we'll be able to balance the 22 budget. And it's not just a wish and a prayer. I think it's all the work that's been done by you and the council and so forth. So that's my caveat. As far as the budget for the operating, the maintenance, I still think we should go at that number hard to determine what that is. And understand that to do that is going to take the right timing. Just because we have identified $600,000 worth of maintenance that we need to start to address doesn't mean it's all going to be enacted in FY22. Maybe a larger increase to that operating budget is going to be required just to get us heading in the direction that we want to.
Okay, thank you, Tony. I said early in the meeting that I do have a hockey practice, everyone, so I do have to leave the meeting here shortly. Been a lot of information going on here. Julie and Eric, with the two of you here, we still have our quorum. Do you want to stay on for a bit longer with Tony? Or?
I'm available if needed. If not, I'm good. whatever you need.
I hope I
What about
didn't,
you?
I hope I didn't overdo it on you there.
No,
Nate,
no, you
what-
didn't at all. No, you weren't in the beginning where I said I had hockey practice, Tony. Don't worry about it.
Okay.
So Nate, here's what I would suggest, because I think we could continue the conversation, obviously, but I think maybe the three of us should get together offline, set up another subcommittee meeting, and
Okay.
kind of go through what Tony put forth today,
I agree.
and put together some questions and things along that nature. Because us continuing the conversation without you, we're gonna have to play catch up anyway. And so my
Well,
suggestion is we just set up another meeting when the three of us can get back together.
Okay, I agree because I've seen these for years now, and kind of being out in the front end like this, it's raised a whole bunch of questions and possibilities and everything else, so I certainly would. I mean, the other thing I could do is I could keep you on as I'm driving, and Eric, you just kind of take over what I've been doing.
That's your call. I already have some questions that I kind of want to go through with you guys. So,
Okay.
and
All right.
one of the things, and Nate, if you have to jump off, but Tony, I'd be really interested just to kind of see, like, if you were putting together.
I'm going to stay on, but listen, okay?
Yep. Thanks, Nate.
Okay, but
And
I'm
we'll-
kind of
and
not
we'll-
here.
Yeah, we'll wrap this up rather quickly. And Julia, if you have any questions, I'll
Yeah, this is my first one. Well,
Yeah.
other than the one we had last year a little bit, but okay, go ahead. You guys are the veterans at this stuff.
So no, I just, Tony, I think the one question I would have for you, and I think Bill has kind of asked us to take a look at this and rethink it, right? And I think there's no person in the town more prepared and educated on the subject than yourself. And I just don't know how often we actually kind of sit back and say, Tony, if you were drafting this, what are some of your thoughts and why? Right.
Mhm.
And I'm not asking you to do what Mr. Woods
Yeah.
asked us to do.
Yeah.
But I am curious, because I think, if we hadn't had this initial conversation, I don't know that we would have spent a lot of time on things like, what do we put aside for maintenance of buildings? I know you've been talking about it for the last several years, right? Getting a capital plan, doing preventative maintenance, taking care of our assets, et cetera. But we probably would have glossed over that. So, one of the things I'm thinking about is, and I have some thoughts, and I think it probably makes sense for all of us fairly soon to just take a step back, write down our questions, et cetera, and reconvene. But in the same breath, I kind of say, if there were 2 or 3 things that you could change about the policy, what are they and why? Because I think a big part of our responsibility is to work with the finance director. It's why Michael years ago saw such a need for the position. I think it's been a big win for the town. And so I really would like your thoughts on a few things as we look to kind of give some suggestions back to town council. And then I think, we as a team have to kind of look at not only those suggestions, but the questions we have and come up with something, because I think your point was spot on. We can start the conversations. I don't see big changes this year just because of all the uncertainty. And I'm very happy to hear you feel a little bit more comfortable than maybe we do to some extent. So that's good news for the day. But that's kind of where my head's at. And I know that Nate has hockey practice, and Julie, I'll see if you have any questions before we sign off. But I would love to get some just high level thoughts from you in a more formal process, and then we'll put together our thoughts as well, and then maybe all 4 of us can reconvene.
Absolutely. Some of which I can just say that we'll probably start to break out some of the the revenue pieces, they can be categorized and defined more clearly so that the group, and I look at this as I move on a few years from now, that it is kind of like a living, breathing document so that this body and any other future body can understand the types of revenue that come in and how they behave differently and what might be a policy for motor vehicle excise on revenue than it is for building permits. And so there definitely can be some just work and further definition. I also believe there should be a connection to some other policies. We don't have any other written policies that have been adopted by council or the finance committee that this would connect into or point to, or the policy would point to this. And so I think what we're talking is there's some integration work that's required in manifesting this more and codifying it more. And then I think part of it is the information that we're lacking as management team from a facilities person that really knows that side of the business and can inform and partner with us in that defining of what actually is needed for resources and what different ways are there to think about how we go about doing that and so forth, as well as on the infrastructure side for roadways. The town manager has told council he's acting on finding a DPW director. Again, is this a bad time to be looking and maybe we find someone? That's going to be a hard find the right person. So there's a lot of pieces that are going to go into informing you guys and informing me and informing these policies. So I will certainly give you my direct ideas on what I would change, but I wanted to give you that as also an additional backdrop to how I approach things. I look at them in a very, very much an integrated way. So when you're ready, you guys meet and digest what you've heard. You know me, I'm ready when you are to do any work. Okay.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, again, I always use the ambulance fund as a great example where I think, we put a cap on it. You had explained it to me years ago, and maybe even to a cavalier perspective, I completely understood why we were changing it and why we didn't need to be as conservative as we had in the past. And I think spelling that out in a document
Yes, I
will help
agree.
other folks understand why we're doing what we're doing.
Correct.
And they can kind of look back to say, okay, now I get it.
Yep.
Okay, so you're not gambling at all. You're not even not being conservative. You're being very conservative. We're in the past being way too far conservative because we didn't have visibility to some things. So no, that's perfect.
Yeah, that's a great example, and that's where my mind's eye is at, is how do you begin to break this down and make it even clearer?
Perfect. So
All right.
Julie, I'll pause there and see if you have anything for tonight.
Good for tonight.
Okay, and if not, what I think we should do is I'll shoot a text to Nate as a result of this. Try to get Julie, myself, you, and Nate back together so we can kind of put additional comments, questions to Tony. Tony will get you kind of a more formal ask than we just kind of talked through at a very high level.
Yep.
And then when you have some time to pull that together, and we get the holidays obviously, and I'm sure people are even with all the lockdowns have some vacation time and family time scheduled, but we'll keep the ball rolling and we'll go from there. And I appreciate your help tonight. So.
You got it. Julie, Nate, and Eric, you guys have a good night. Thank you, Ian.
Thank you, Tony. Appreciate it. Thank you, Ian.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Have a nice night.
You too.
Do we need a motion to adjourn?
Go ahead. You make a
Motion to adjourn.
I'll second it.
Aye,
Thank
aye.
you. Aye. Yeah.
Okay, it's all
Thank
good.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.